We'll move on to apologies. We have an apology from Councillor Hall for absence and an apology from Councillor Wiley for an early departure. I'll move that those apologies be accepted. Seconded, Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Against? Carried. On to confirmation of the agenda. I'll move from the Chair that we confirm the agenda with the following alterations. That item 20 be taken before item 18 due to external representatives' availability to speak to this report, and in regard to Standing Order 2.1 that option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. Seconded, Councillor Staines. Councillor Vandervis.
I'm unhappy with the deficiencies that I see in the confidential agenda and would like to make a procedural motion under 24.2A that and I've circulated last Wednesday my concerns about this confidential agenda. I'd like to move under 24.2A that the meeting be adjourned to the next ordinary meeting, and hopefully we'll get the information that we need in the meantime.
So this is the
confidential part.
The confidential part. So
of this meeting. I'm happy with the rest of the agenda.
Can I have some clarification? I just need some clarification as to process here. What we're confirming here is the whole agenda, is it? Or just the public agenda? I'm just working out the order in which I want to make the decisions. Okay, what I'm going to suggest is that we confirm the public agenda, vote on that, and then come back to your is that?
When we get to the confidential section.
When we get to the confidential section, if you like. I think that's that way we address it in its own context rather than in the context of the whole agenda. So just to note, councillors, that what we're confirming here is the public part of the agenda, not the whole agenda. Okay? Is everyone happy with that? And you're happy to have seconded that, Councillor Staines? All right. That being the case, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, declarations of interest. I'll move that the Council notes and amends, if necessary, the elected members' interest register and confirms and amends the proposed management plan for elected members' interests. And I note, and perhaps I should have done this some time ago, I need to amend my interest given my recent election as President of LGNZ. And so I'd like that added to the register of interests. But with that amendment, second, Councillor Staines, any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. And I'll move on to the Executive Leadership Team Declaration of Interest. I'll move that the Council notes / amends, if necessary, the Executive Leadership Team's interest register attached as Attachment A and confirms the proposed management plan for the Executive Leadership Team's interests. Secondly, Councillor Staines. Is there any discussion on that? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay, on to the minutes of committees. Item 6, Infrastructure Services Networks Committee. Councillor Wilson.
Apologies for lateness for the public forum. I'd like to move that the Council notes the minutes of the Infrastructure Services and Networks Committee meeting held on the 16th of October 2017.
Seconded, Councillor O'Malley. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 7, Community and Culture Committee. Councillor Hawkins.
Tēnā Your Worship, I'll move that the Council notes Part A items and the public forum of the minutes of the Community and Culture meeting held 17 October 2017 and further approves the Part B items 9 through 11 from the same meeting and then takes Part C items of the minutes of the Community and Culture meeting of 17 October in the non-public part of this meeting.
Seconded, Councillor Laufiso. Is there any discussion? Councillor Vandervis.
Just regarding the taking the non-public parts, that may have to not happen in this meeting if we are successful in delaying that. I'm talking about C.
Yes, I take your point. That would be a natural consequence.
Okay.
Is this the part that wants to delay? I suspect it's the other.
Yeah, the part that I take it that the part of the meeting that you wish to lay on the table from the non-public part is the other agenda
Yes,
item.
yes. So, okay, in that case,
Yeah.
it may be part of the meeting that we move rather than the whole lot. Thank you.
That's fine. Okay, everyone understand that? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Item 6, Planning and Environment Committee, Councillor Benson Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. I move that Council notes the minutes of the Planning and Environment Committee meeting held on the 17th of October 2017.
Seconded, Councillor Steadman. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Bylaws Subcommittee, Councillor Wiley.
Yeah, Your Worship, I move that Council recommends notes Part A of the minutes of the Bylaws Subcommittee meeting held on the 21st of August 2017.
Seconded, Councillor Lord. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. On to the minutes of the community boards. Would anyone like to move? I think there are 8 of them. And if you're happy to, I'll accept a movement of 8.
Happy to move all items 10 to 17 of the Mosgiel Community Board, Otago Peninsula Community Board, 2 of the Saddle Hill, 1 of the Strathtorrey, 2 of the Wakawati Coast and 1 of the West Harbour Community Board.
Second to Councillor Wiley. Any discussion on any of that? Thank you. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. All right. Can I invite, we're going on to the reports, and as I said earlier, we've got item 20 ahead of item 18, so can I invite Julian Tan and Amanda Nichols of Audit New Zealand and Gavin up to join us, please. Welcome.
Probably just for the benefit of elected members, we have Julian Tan, who's the Audit Director from Audit New Zealand. He's new to the DCC audit this year, having replaced Scott Tobin, who moved on to a different role within Audit New Zealand, and Amanda Nichols, who you should all know or remember from previous meetings. Otherwise, we're happy to take questions.
Councillors, questions? Oh, that's a clean audit.
Not exactly, Your Worship.
You're uncharacteristically tardy, Councillor Vandervis.
Well, it was largely because I didn't really have a question as such, but I can put it in that form if that suits.
It's required.
As required. Having voted against the City Council annual report, largely because of its manifest deferred maintenance, which to my mind is just another way of hiding debt, and given that I voted against approving and adopting the City Council annual report in the past, what are my options in this particular case? Can I still just simply vote against the recommendation?
You can vote as your conscience dictates. I notice that the 3 parts of the resolution are authorises. They're going to be presented in a different order from the way they are here. So it's authorise, approve and authorise. Authorise and approve. So you can decide not to authorise the signing of them, and you can choose not to approve if that's consistent with your beliefs.
Thank you for that direction, and I will take that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions? All right, Councillor Outler.
Hi, I was just wanting to ask you, in your point of view, what the strengths of this report is and what came, investment-wise.
Or for Anne?
Yourself.
In terms of what are you wanting specifically?
It's the returns.
Again, so the report is consistent with the report that we put up for the June year end to the last Finance Committee meeting. which reported on the operating surplus and obviously talked about the debt. So the debt's currently sitting at $202 million. That is favourable to budget, and it reflects the fact that the capital spend has been under budget. If you go through the report, that's mentioned a number of times in terms of the rationale behind some of those shortfalls. We've talked about the LED lights, where we've spent the time choosing the correct lighting configuration. Obviously, the Peninsula widening project is delayed, but it's now out for tender. The Ross Creek was one where it was caught up in consenting processes. And then there's been a number of water renewals where there has been delays due to the availability of contractors or contractors not committing to pricing that's appropriate to the work we want to get done. So that, again, if you read through the report in part of section 2, also the Chief Executive's report, and then some of the narrative on the financials, it talks about those things. And obviously it's something that we will have to address as an organisation as part of our 10-year plan.
Thank you.
Councillor Lord.
Gavin, I'm just trying to phrase this as a question too, just not sure how to do it, but these things, those answers you've just given us about those capital expenditure items, that's been well signalled to us as a council, and we've known those things for quite some time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yep, thank you.
Further question?
What I'm meaning, it's not a surprise to us that some of these projects didn't happen for the aforementioned reasons.
Right, if there are no further questions, I will move from the chair, and as I say, these are now on the board and they are in a different order, and that is the only... and there's also the addition in C, and it reads, approves and adopts the Dunedin City Council's annual report with the auditor's report. That phrase has been included as well. So that's the difference between what's on the order paper and what's on the screen and what we're voting on. So I'm going to move from the chair that we authorise and approve and adopt. Seconded Councillor Staines. Is there discussion? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to thank the staff, and especially Dr Bidrose and Mr Logie, for providing this report. I think it's an excellent result, and while some members may wish to focus on the things that haven't happened this year, I think it's outstanding what has happened and come in within budget and been done. It's been a very, very big year for the city. I have had 3 meetings, one unfortunately at the car service station today when my car broke down, and I have to say that I've had 3 meetings today of really positive news and how well business is doing in Dunedin. But it's also good news about a lot of things that have been happening from this council. And yes, we can look at the negatives. I've yet to manage to do all my housework ever that I've intended to do. And I think it's a bit like that in the city. You can have aspirations to do a whole lot of things in the city. The fact that we deliver on 70, 80 or 90% of that and do it well rather than doing it because it has to be done and doing it badly, I'm comforted by the fact that those projects are still there. They're just going to be done the right way. So thank you to Dr Bidrose and to Mr Logie especially. I think it's the first one that you've had to do by yourself. Well done.
Councillor van der Vis.
I find myself having to disagree entirely with Councillor Wilson. The aspirations that she talks about that you don't always achieve are not the issues that worry me. Keeping our spend on depreciation, especially in infrastructure like drainage, is not an aspiration. Our spend on maintenance of our drainage systems, and I'm especially thinking of South Dunedin, is our duty. Maintenance is not an aspiration, as suggested by Councillor Wilson. It is our duty, and it is something which we have underspent by almost 50% this last year, on top of consistent underspending in a number of previous years. Councillor Wilson has said it's outstanding what has happened in this last year, and she may have a point there, but what to me is outstanding is what hasn't happened. We haven't spent an enormous amount of the capital budget that was supposed to maintain the infrastructure that has long been letting us down. We haven't caught up with the depreciation levels spending that was brought to our attention at least 5 years ago and perhaps more before that. We haven't maintained the fundamental infrastructure, and there are a number of good reasons why we haven't, but I believe that there are a number of other reasons that are not so good, where simply by not spending what's required on infrastructure, we have made it look like the debt is not getting any worse. And to me, that is very short-sighted. The kind of criticism that we've levelled at Delta and Aurora for not maintaining their network, I believe we are also guilty of actually doing here at the DCC. We are not maintaining our own networks, especially in water, but also in roading and footpaths. And it's for this reason that I have in the past voted against adopting this plan, because I don't think it's sustainable. I'm quite happy that authorities be given to the Mayor and Chief Executive to authorise things. That's right and proper. But you don't have to look too far into this plan to realise that infrastructure has been going backwards. Capital spend has been a fraction of what it should have been on infrastructure, and that if we don't do the basic maintenance to keep the mechanics of this city running, then the aspirations that Councillor Wilson suggested are never going to be within our reach. We need to do that on the basis of a properly maintained infrastructure. Thanks for your patience again.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
I've got a point of order, Mr Chair, Your Worship.
Point of order.
Please clarify for me, if you would. This is a motion about the adoption and approval of the annual report. It's not an annual plan discussion. It's not a document in advance about planned council expenditure. And so while I didn't interrupt the councillor while he was speaking, it's accurate to suggest that the speech was entirely irrelevant to the matter under discussion. And so I've not been able to resist raising this point, but I didn't want to interrupt him. But there's no reason why, because it's a report on factual performance against budgets and an audit of that performance. Everything that was said about the priorities was completely irrelevant. Is that correct?
My reading of the councillor's speech was that he was giving his reasons for not, and I assume he is going to be consistent in what he said earlier, not approving and adopting the Dunedin City Council annual report. I think that a good number of his conclusions were wrong, not to say absolute rubbish, but I believe that he sincerely believes them, and they are the basis for his not voting to approve this. So I'm not going to allow the point of order. Well, no, I don't need it. No, I don't need further clarification.
No, I was just wanting, if possible, to allay Councillor Benson-Pope's fears with his own words. I can do it afterwards.
I don't need you to, thank you. Okay, are there any other speakers? Councillor Gary.
I would like to add my voice to thanks to the staff, to Dr Vidrose and to Mr Logie and other staff who've contributed to the phenomenal amount of work that has gone into this. I'm a half-glass full kind of person as opposed to a half-glass empty, and we can always find things we haven't done. But I just want to rest on one particular project that's mentioned in here. And just reflect on that for a moment. So that's the Peninsula Connection, which has been delayed for good reason, and as Councillor Lord talked about, we've known that is the case, and it's going to deliver for our community. And yes, the costs have increased, but it's very positive. So if you were a half-glass empty person, you would look at that very negatively. I'm a half-glass full person, and I see that as a huge positive. So thank you to the staff for the immense amount of work and a great result for the city. We can always do better, but this is very positive.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, well, I just thought while we were giving thanks, I'd just like to say thanks to Juliet and Amanda as well. I've had to work with them through my role as Chair of the Finance Committee, and I have found that a pleasant experience and been enjoyable working with you, so thank you. And Gavin and Sue as well.
The Chief Executive has indicated she wishes to make some comment on this item.
Look, I would like to say, yes, that is, we are not 100% funding renewals this year, that is right. Water did so last year, I think, for the first time for a very long time, but not this year for a number of reasons. It's important for councillors just to remember that while depreciation is a linear set amount right through the LTP, the renewals work program is not. So it does go up and down, and as we have now been saying for 4 years, we are playing catch up, and part of the early work for that is getting in place a team who are capable of delivering the work program. What I'm confident of is that we now have in place an exceedingly good team, which is building on some work that's been going on for some time, who are able to deliver what is in their budget, barring unforeseen events. But with those unforeseen events, that money pays off debt. It doesn't just get frittered away, so it gives us headroom to actually, when we do catch up, to get this work done. And you'll see, as per the last annual plan, LTP discussion, you'll see in the LTP that the renewals budget is very uneven across the years. Some years we are comfortably ahead of depreciation, and other years we are behind, depending on whether we're focusing on new builds or whether we're focusing 100% on renewals. And maintenance is, of course, on top of, it's outside of renewals. So the maintenance program is underway and the team are doing a good job, and there's been substantial effort to change the way our contractors deliver that maintenance requirement, which I think we're also seeing. So it's important to note that we are maintaining levels of service. The network is not depreciating, and we are maintaining the levels of service, which was a commitment that was made. A lot of work is done to increase the level of service in South Dunedin. That will be addressed during the long-term plan because that's a sizeable budget.
Any further speakers? Well, can I just comment that I think that this is a very good result, but the points that have been made about the challenges of meeting maintenance, renewal and depreciation costs point up the challenges that councils have all over the country. We have local government across New Zealand owns and manages some $120 billion worth of assets. And in large part, we are required to allow for depreciation of that. Now, that alone would probably increase the rates across councils in New Zealand by 2 or 3% just to allow for maintenance and depreciation and renewals, let alone what we are asked to do by our communities in terms of investing in new infrastructure, or that we are required to do when there's a new wastewater plant or a new stormwater system needs to be put in. So I think that this report illustrates how well that our staff have done, given that challenge across the country. And it's a challenge that is not going to get any easier as we confront the need to, for instance, invest in enhanced infrastructure to cope with climate change adaptation, for example. So I think as the Chief has said, I think it's been very prudent that we have, that she and her staff have set in place the basics for making good, prudent financial decisions, because had we just, had they made the decision to just spend the money that was in the budget come what may, we would not have been in as good a position. We would maybe have made a lot of mistakes, and we've certainly done that in the past, where we've rushed into things without the right expertise and the right knowledge, and then we've found we've had to redo it, and it's cost a lot more. So I think this has been a wise husbanding of resources, and the trend in terms of the quality of our infrastructure and how it's looked after is definitely on the up. So this is a good outcome, and we're tracking, in my view, very well. Okay, I think that was my right of reply. So I will now put this. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? No. You recorded Councillor Bannis against. That's carried. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, councillors, we'll move back to item 18. And I think we invite Ms Gunn and Ms Pinfold to speak to us. Oh, and Tammy. Sorry? Welcome. Now, do you wish to open up and speak to this first? Or
Just very briefly.
fire away.
Kia ora koutou. Just to give you a very brief overview before we head into this report. We have had a couple of questions around the timing of the consultation. So within the report itself, we've recommended public consultation on the draft festivals and events plan 2018 to 2023, that public consultation occur in November. If that was the case and Council adopted a confirmed plan, hopefully in February when one was presented, we would look to adopt any changes in the first round of our usual grants for premier and major events in April 2018. But if the consultation period was deferred until the later time of April, it would be likely that any changes wouldn't be adopted till the 1st of July. So that may not have been clear in our report to you. I just wanted to clarify that. Apart from that, perhaps we'll just allow you to ask us whatever you wish.
Well, not quite.
In relation to the report.
Any questions? Appropriate questions, councillors. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for that clarification. When you say May, is that when applications are due?
In April, sorry. In April, we open up the round. So if, as the actual plan at this point has a reclassification of what that round would be, so it may no longer be the major and premier events, it would likely be major community and niche events round, and we traditionally open that round for grant funding in April with a month's time frame for applications, close it in May, and then have our grants in June, grants assessment.
Given the nature of the reclassification, where you'll have some people who potentially would have come to the September round for funding this calendar year, but may be reclassified into a niche but have already applied, so can't obviously apply again for that same event. I just wonder whether consideration had been given to it being tidier, perhaps, to take effect from the start of financial year, which is the cycle we use, as opposed to kind of towards the end of that.
I think actually, well, we have considered that, but because we have 3 different rounds of funding, so we have a round that's open from March for community events and a round in September for community events, and then currently our premier and major. I think no matter what time of year, there's going to be some, don't want to say messiness, but some transition period, no matter which time we move into. But I think we'll be guided by Council's view on when you want us to adopt this and put it into action.
Further question? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I've got more. I'm just thinking.
No such
you can hear it if you listen closely enough. The cogs turning, yeah. But if it were to if it were to take effect from the 1st of July, then from that point, people would be able to, groups or events would be able to assess for themselves where to most appropriately apply for funding. And I appreciate that it's not going to be a vast number that may be moving into a different sphere, but there will be undoubtedly some, and that's the point, is to try and support them. But I don't see how it can't be tidier to do it as a financial year break rather than mid-term. But maybe I'm not making my point clear enough. That's fine. The language around phasing out funding for events, and I'm paraphrasing, is something that's come up often in discussions of that committee. But my understanding is that our grants policy is silent on essentially term limits for funding for events. So is this a signal that this is what to expect in the forthcoming review of our grants policy, or how do you see it working in practice, what is signalled in the text?
I'm unclear in terms of your phrasing around the phasing out of funding, where that's come from in the text of the plan.
Fine,
I don't think we've specifically referenced any phasing out of funding.
Okay, I'll find it and come back to it. Those were my words, but the implication is that people can't expect to get funding for this event forever to make room for new events coming through.
I think what we've referenced is that ideally we want events to be sustainable, and that there are other avenues outside of council which could be potentially explored with council staff. So sponsorships, or even multi-sponsor opportunities for a number of events that run together or run very close to each other, opportunities to think about promotion of events, and so it's not saying we would phase out funding at all. I think it's how do we think about funding, and also relevance of festivals and events. Some will have a lifespan, and so that's the opportunity and the positivity of a strong relationship with the sector to talk with festival and event organisers when an event may be needing to change its focus, or have it, or if its lifespan is over. I mean, I can't think of an event off the top of my head right now where we would say that, but we think about our young people, what they might be looking for from festivals and events in the future might be slightly different than what some are providing today. So I don't think we were actually, if the idea of phasing out funding has come through to you in the report, then that is not the intention.
It's really heartening to hear. We only have to look to the Wellington Sevens as a not too far from home example of events that seem to run their course.
Yes.
I have two more further questions. One is around the impact assessments that we currently require of premier events, and the threshold for that is over $100,000 in terms of a grant, or around about that figure. And that's being proposed to cover any event that's granted $50,000 or more. Do we have an understanding of how expensive those are, or how arduous those are? I mean, or are you essentially creating is there a perverse outcome potentially where the ceiling is 50k because anything above that just gets sucked up in your reporting rather than being invested in the event?
Yep. They're around $2,000 is the estimate that we've received around that. There is some internal discussion at the moment as to who pays that, whether that is actually a cost that we would fund to have them done, or whether that's in part to the event organiser, so that hasn't been clarified yet. Events under that could do an assessment with no cost, and we obviously don't want these to be the kind of assessment that takes you many hours and takes your resource off organising the event or festival, so something fairly straightforward, but an actual consistent model across, which would allow the ability really both for the organisers and council and other funders to say this is the benefit to this community. And I think it does relate to a little bit to that, when does an event potentially need to look at changing, or has it done its lifespan as part of that down the track? But more positively, to know on a more regular basis what the positive impacts of those events are for the city.
And just finally, it is silent, the draft, on what brackets of funding, if you like, are available to each of these four. Is it the intention is that flexible by design to allow for the discretion of the grants subcommittee, or is that something that you're actively looking for feedback on through this process to be able to make that a little clearer in terms of where people might see themselves fitting?
Both, actually. I would say firstly that staff do have a bit of an idea of where we think those figures may sit, but we wanted to leave that open through the consultation process to get feedback, and then obviously we would want a conversation with the grant subcommittee about that after the consultation ended.
Councillor van der Vis.
Nice to see that you've got a fairly comprehensive overview here. What I was hoping to see was perhaps some slightly more specific, for instance, in your aiming high. Have you considered a permanent Octagon events stage similar to the one that we used to have before there was an issue with a consent in the Octagon?
As far as I'm aware, we haven't considered a permanent stage, but we did trial last year and we'll look at redoing it again. Events over lunch times, so something specifically over lunchtime in the summer months were trialled for the community, but we could engage within council about further discussions about the stage.
Thank you. And also, while you're thinking of trialling things, have you considered trialling a perhaps lunchtime live mic in the Octagon where anybody can get up and sing or talk or make fools of themselves? You know, sort of an informal version of what we do here, perhaps.
The team have already challenged me to that, haven't you? No, we have actually been talking with our community events advisor about something like that for young songwriters and performers, quite specifically to trial that next year and give that a bit of a go. And that's in partly to particularly engage with our youth community.
Wonderful.
I'm sure that could expand to other age groups.
Great. And my last question really relates to the large events that we have coming, and we've had a few of them so far, and the extreme shortage of accommodation. And I'm wondering, has any progress been made in encouraging temporary supply of accommodation in private homes? We're all aware that there's quite a lot of Airbnb type accommodation coming on stream, and also aware that we don't have enough hotel accommodation for really big events here. Has there been anything done to really utilise a lot of private home accommodation that could be made available perhaps for extreme events? I'm thinking of, you know, large stadium events where there simply isn't enough accommodation really in the town through traditional sources.
I can talk to that. First and foremost, we as a city will always point people to the direction of the eyesight, and they're very good at being able to act as a coordination point for accommodation within town, and they're constantly reporting to us on what they have available, so we're aware of what's available, so we can target messaging and promotions around that. For example, as of this morning, there's still accommodation available through the eyesight for both Ed Sheeran and the Pink concerts, so we always drive that messaging to people to check with the eyesight first. As you've mentioned, there are other options within the city, so Airbnb is one of those options that's available as well, and there is a new business which is about to be launched shortly, which is called Look After Me, which is exactly as you mentioned. It's a person who vets private homes for people. So that's a business that we're aware of, that we've been working around as well, that we will look to work with around some of these major events.
Thank you, that's very helpful. In the event, as we get closer to Ed Sheeran or Pink, and we find that perhaps there isn't enough around, is there a role for council to play, do you think, in encouraging people to make homes available for the eyesight? I mean, do we have a plan B if we find that things really are getting tight? I would hate to think that we have this wonderful, there's these wonderful concerts coming up, these events coming up, and not be able to cater properly for people wanting to come.
Chief.
We have had a discussion with it about it as council, but of course for us there's insurance implications. So insurance implications if we're recommending private housing and then something were not to happen. The joy of the woman who's doing this as a private business is that's her entire business model. So we will be leveraging her in order to do exactly what you say, but without it having to go through the council. We'll go through staff and the eyesight are well connected with her, but it won't be us specifically pointing people to individual houses or acting as the matchmaker, if you like.
No, I completely understand that. What I was suggesting was that if we do get to a pinch point, that perhaps we could suggest that people might want to contact the eyesight if they were able to help out. That's just as a plan B.
It would do.
Thank
Mr. Elder.
Thank you for putting this report together, and I recommend it's really clear and the processes are clear there, and well done. One of the questions I have is around transport, because after big events and before big events, when we've got lots of people in town, I hear feedback from people that it's impossible to get a taxi, for example. So what are our plans around big events and transport?
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if you're aware, there's a group that exists called the City Coordination Group. So it's made up of key stakeholders within the city. So for example, you've got representatives from DVML there, the airport, Hotel Motel Association, so all the key stakeholders in the city, and the purpose of that group is to work towards preparing for major events such as we've got at the moment. So that group identifies risks and areas of challenge that we've got in the city and how we're going to work through those as a group. So we've done a number of risk exercises, looked at what those might be and how we can bring on extra bodies and how we can address things like that. So it may be from a transport point of view quite broad, so it's not just additional buses from the stadium, it's how people interact right from how they get from the airport into town, pressure points entering and exiting city, do we use Taieri Gorge Railway, things like that. So there are groups established that are thinking about that wider city network and wider city coordination around events as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Garrett.
Thank you for your work on this really important plan for our city. I had a question. I certainly saw some of this touched on in the plan, but perhaps it wasn't as strong as I had anticipated, and I just wanted to explore that and ask you about that. And it was around the importance of the all year round activities and festivals and the importance of that. It touches on the economic development, but particularly in terms of employment in the visitor industry and it encouraging and enabling that, which is a goal that we have as a city. As I understand it. So I just wondered if you might speak to that. It certainly was touched on, but I'd be pleased to hear from you on that.
We know that seasonality is definitely something that's quite unique to Dunedin in terms of we have lots of events that want to run in our warmer months, so February, March, April tends to be quite congested, and then we do have peaks and troughs within the year, but there's also synergies that we encourage events to look at in terms of if there's a large event coming to town, that it may be beneficial in having that event back onto it as well. So, for example, if there's trends, there might be an opportunity for another event to leverage off that as well. There's also a need to identify a one-stop calendar is what the industry has told us, and that will help with planning right across the year, and that goes right across from hotels, motels, airlines, so that they can see and plan for when all those big events are. So there's definitely some work that needs to be done around that. Thank you.
I just wanted to add to that. DVML have established a event bidding role for the city, and that part of that role in working, which works with us, is to look at supporting a year-round calendar of events and bringing those types of events into our city at times when we may not have anything else happening, as well as at times that we could leverage off other events.
Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your mahi on this plan. I'm just looking at page 40 and looking at the development of the plan, and you talk about initial feedback from the People's Panel. Can you just briefly say what the key trends or responses were in terms of that feedback, please?
No, I can identify it. From the People's Panel, there was certainly some key themes that came across, and that was the seasonality of events and how to address the peaks and troughs in events. There was a very clear need or desire to have healthy events, came across very, very strongly, and to, I think, be brave and aspirational were some of the terms that were used there, that Dunedin should celebrate what's unique and special about itself and really celebrate that, and whether that means that we look at attracting other events, bringing other events to Dunedin and putting a Dunedin slant on them, or whatever that might look like. But I think that those were the key themes that were identified. And also growing and nurturing and supporting our existing industry, so that means looking after them through being able to provide workshops, support, creating a really strong culture of events here in Dunedin.
No further questions? Okay. Would someone like to move the Councillor Staines, second to Councillor Wiley. That's the resolutions on the order paper. There's two there. I'll invite discussion. Councillor Staines, do you want to speak to it in the first instance? I'll invite discussion. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'd like to mihi to staff too for what has been a thankless task in trying to herd all the relevant cats to try and get this work to this stage. I support the draft plan. I have no issues with that. My concerns are around the proposed timeline. So I'll struggle to support the resolutions as put. This has funding implications, obviously, not just for council, but for community groups and event producers, groups who are used to us operating on a financial year basis, and changing the rules midway through a financial year, I don't think is the best way of going about that. It would be cleaner and fairer, I think, for any changes to take effect from the 1st of July. And to that end, I don't see the rush in terms of going out for public consultation on this, asking us to venture into the democratic dead zone that is immediately before Christmas, to try and get meaningful feedback across the months of November and December, when we could do it in the new year, heading towards a July 1 deadline. as I said, I have no problems with the draft. I welcome the greater degree of flexibility. The Grants Subcommittee has been challenged for some years around the lack of flexibility we've had in being able to particularly support new events grow from being more grassroots affairs to things that are of a far bigger profile in our own community and potentially ultimately as attractors for other people to our city. It does make me nervous whenever I see something strategically geared towards an app. There's a lot of false hope in the power of the app. When we talk about having a complete guide and a complete calendar of all events that are ever taking place in the city, we're never going to achieve that. You're never going to get everything that's happening into one place. And I think if we're convincing promoters and producers especially that they can rely on it being a complete list, we are doing them a disservice. It certainly is useful from a consumer point of view, but it does. I am sceptical of the value that it could have for people who are producing events. But I welcome feedback on all of that and particularly around the quantums of money that people in our community feel that the 4 categories of events are worth investing in. But I can't support consulting on something as important as this immediately before Christmas when I don't believe the urgency exists to do it at that period. Thanks.
Further speakers? So there are no further speakers. I note your points, Councillor Hawkins, and now that we've had all the speakers on this, I suggest that you may wish to raise an amendment if that's the end you want to achieve. Councillor Staines. So, yeah. Right. So, okay. Write a reply. Councillor Staines.
I think the draft is a good draft, and a draft's purpose is for consultation. I do have a little bit of concern. I don't think that we quite get into the death period for consultation here. I've had situations in the past where our consultation has started in December and gone through to January, and I think that is not an acceptable consultation period. So I think 22nd of November for opening of the consultation period is not really getting into that death zone, but if there was any possibility that that could come forwards by a week, it would be helpful, I think. And clearly, once it is out there for consultation, we'll get a feel for whether the proposed changes are going to have an impact on the events that we help fund. So I'm sure we will get a good response to this, and I guess it's up to all of us to make sure that we remind the organisations that do currently receive grants that they should consider making a submission on the draft.
Right. Everyone's spoken. I'm going to put it. Is there a wish that I put these separately? Right. Okay, I'm going to put it all together. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay. Move on to proposed meeting. Now, it's my intention to do this, item 9, handle item 19 and then take a break because we've been going for over 2 hours, but we'll just hopefully get through this one relatively quickly. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Joy. Welcome, Ms. Graham. So this is item 19, the proposed meeting schedule for 2018, and I think Ms.
I'm on my own.
Oh, right. So, do you want to introduce this?
No, I'm happy to take questions.
We'll just go straight to questions, Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Graham. I just wondered if you wanted to expand upon the logic behind the 10 a.m. meeting. I'm not particularly concerned about the start time, but our committee meetings have run at under an hour, which is okay when they're sequential, but something of an imposition when councillors are expected to be there for the next round. 1. So, oh, we've got an answer coming. Thank you.
That mic's not on.
Councillors, we've experienced some difficulty with transitioning of GSOs between the two back-to-back meetings on those particular agendas itself, and so what we've proposed is that we have a meeting in the morning, a meeting in the afternoon with lunch provided in between so that we can accommodate.
Any further questions? There being none, would someone like to move the Councillor Staines? Second, Councillor. Was it you, who had their hand up? Oh, yeah, Councillor Newell. I know. I was distracted by Councillor Lord's hand and hiding behind another. Any speakers? No one wants to speak. Right, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Sandy. And we will now, I'll move from the chair that we break for 15 minutes. Come back at past. Seconded, Councillor Wiley. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried.
Good afternoon, councillors. Prior to taking some questions, we'll just provide a brief update. Well, actually, I'll just provide a brief update following the changes to the national certification of certified self-contained camper vans. Since that amendment passed and is going to take effect on the 31st of January, there has been a working group formed that has involved 6 councils, including Dunedin City Council, members of Local Government New Zealand, the New Zealand Motor Caravan Association. This group met at the end of September to look at working on a consistent approach across the country in terms of how the Freedom Camping Act is reviewed and how it is implemented. Discussions on freedom camping have continued around the rental car companies and developing an adequate system on how the vehicles can be tagged to the rental car company rather than to the person as they currently are. And this will allow for infringements to be received in at a higher percentage than is currently happening across many of different councils in the country. Discussions on freedom camping at a national level have really moved away from making provisions for non-certified self-contained. The approach now is to direct these types of vehicles to camping grounds or other accommodation providers. An update on our neighbouring councils. We have had some very high-level discussions with Waitaki, Central Otago, Queenstown and Clutha District Council on having some communication and education to visitors coming into our wider region with the hope that we can get some consistencies so travellers crossing into one region have some familiarity with how we're dealing with different types of freedom camping visitors. We're continuing to work with the Department of Conservation on identifying areas for dock campsites across the Otago region and specifically in the Dunedin district. This has proved to be difficult as the Department of Conservation also doesn't have an abundance of land that is appropriate for dock campsites. Should the Council approve the subcommittee's recommendations today, we have an implementation plan that will start as of tomorrow, re-educating to any changes that are adopted today. That includes signage at appropriate places such as Warrington and Ocean View, entry roads in and out of those areas, social media and website information to be updated, and similar to how we've dealt with the first bylaw in 2015, we would recommend that we had a monitoring and education process for the first month of the bylaw rather than straight to enforcement to allow for the message, excuse me, to spread amongst the visitors to the district.
Can I invite questions, Councillor? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you very much. This is a tortuous, the most debated bylaw that we've had is in that it's come up, I think most bylaws every 5 years, and this seems to be annual, and fraught, and that's, Yeah. The one issue, and it saddens me that, and I think, and the question I've got is, this will stop the New Zealand right of biking or walking New Zealand with a tent, and not being able to camp on the side of the road or at the nearest domain or reserve, because of the implications that your vehicle will not be certified. And it's the only one that I think is really sad, that the implication of this. Have I got that right, or am I wrong?
So there is still the ability in the proposed bylaw for discretionary permits, which the idea behind that is to ensure that people that have always used trails or camped in reserves, Warrington is a good example of families have been going there for many, many Christmases. There is no intent for that to no longer be permitted under the bylaw. The intent would then be that they would get a discretionary permit. In terms of on the side of cycle trails, that would really depend whether it was council land or Kiwi Rail land or whose land.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question is around the summary of advantages and disadvantages in para 26 at the bottom of page 60. 60. Where it says the advantages of supporting the recommendation include that the freedom camping issues at Warrington Domain and Ocean View Reserve would reduce, and then more importantly that the impact of freedom camping on both sites and across the city would be easier for council to manage. And there's nothing in the report that backs up that final point where, because it seems counterintuitive to say that a more dispersed scattering of people sleeping in vans would be easier for us to manage from a regulatory point of view than knowing they're going to be congregating in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 spots around the city.
I think by the drive to get some real consistency across the region and across the country allows for the messaging to capture these campers when they're first entering New Zealand and, well, ideally New Zealand and then our region. If we look at the last 2 to 3 years of freedom camping, we've had a real drive on implementing the education and getting the message to people and visitors coming where they can and cannot go. I think that looking at the number of infringements we had in the first year of the bylaw and comparing it to the second year of the bylaw, and the understanding of the ways to get in touch with those campers and actually direct them to specific places, I think that is a tool that we need to use, and I do think that it will be easier for council to manage because it will be consistent with how other councils are approaching it.
When you say the effect that that's had on infringements, are you saying that the number of infringements is reduced? So could we infer that the status quo is working?
I don't think
you can infer that people are getting used to what it is that we are doing, both here in Dunedin and in the surrounding areas, that obviously as camping has grown in popularity and these issues have gained more national traction in terms of the communications through apps, etc., there is more consistency in messaging and understanding. So it's actually the education component that's working.
Thank you. And just lastly, do we know whether or not it's currently legal to sleep in a vehicle on the side of the road, notwithstanding anything that we say that we can enforce under local government?
it is legal to rest in the side of the road for the purpose of resting whilst you're travelling.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, my question, I'm going to stay sit down. Am I allowed to do that? Stand up, okay. So my question really is relating to, I can sort of see the intent of this recommendation, and I can largely agree with it, but my question does revolve around, before we had these specific sites, and I think in McAndrew Bay and the problems we had there, before we had a bylaw, before this sort of latest resurgence of freedom camping started, how much did we worry about it? Like, I mean, I travel a lot at night, especially at this time of year, so I see people parking on the side of the road down at Karaki. I see people turning off and stopping at places like Trotter's Gorge. There's a lot of sort of dispersal, and if we pass this bylaw today, if we pass the recommendation, what happens to the other people, and where will they go? Like, have we thought about that? Because I do see it this way, that once you disperse them, the effects become less than, they become minor, because instead of having 20 people soiling themselves or out around trees or whatever, you suddenly get one or two, and it becomes less, and therefore by default it's a smaller problem. But just my concern is, if we pass this, what happens to everyone else? Are we better having no specific sites? Would that be a better way? I don't know if I'm...
So the bylaw, as it's proposed for adoption, non-certified self-contained vehicles now are all directed to camping grounds or other accommodation providers. Any certified self-contained vehicles are still permitted across the city, and our boundaries are part for the areas outlined in Schedule A of those maps. So, yeah.
The question, I suppose, to be a bit more specific then, is so if you are in a non-certified camping vehicle and you're moving your way around the country and you come to Dunedin and you don't want to go to a camping ground, what are they going to do? And the thing that you see is, like, for example, you see people come from out of town to enjoy the student areas, for example, and they'll just sleep in cars around places like Hyde Street and Castle Street and that, because they don't want to drink drive. It's a slightly different view, but they do that, it does happen now, and the question is, I don't think we will end up directing all those people to camping grounds. So how will that work? Or will we have to police a new problem?
Just addressing the latter point, as Jenny said, the national conversation has moved on away from freedom campers to, unless you're certified self-contained, you're going to be in a campground. In terms of the approaching the enforcement, obviously there will be the routine patrols, but it's really about responding to issues. The intention of this bylaw is not to hunt down everybody who's sleeping in their car in Hyde Street because they didn't want to drink drive. So it's really about actually getting the feedback from the public about where are issues actually occurring. So.
Gary.
The question follows on really from Councillor Lord's question, and in the original motion, the second part of it was to explore other options for non-self-contained vehicles, and I guess I would like to hear from you what other avenues have been pursued, and possibly some of those have not been useful or come to anything, but I think it would be really helpful to hear about those options, because I know a lot of work has gone on behind the scenes in looking at those.
So the bylaw relates to council land only. There has been some, following the deliberations, discussions with the brand that's known as Kiwi Camp, and staff have discussed with the owner and operator. It's currently operated out of on private land next to a truck stop. The gentleman himself said that it's not a commercially viable operation. It does need to be supported. Discussing again at that national level, it's not something that councils have looked at. There are ratepayers that run and operate camping grounds across the city, and it's of their opinion that we wouldn't want to be going in a commercial operation against those owner-operators.
The second part of my question is, what kind of feedback have you had from the campground providers around the direction and the recommendation that is before us today, in terms of catering for the non-self-contained vehicles? Has there been any suggestion of a slightly different model within campgrounds, or some new business opportunities perhaps?
So we've had a number of different dialogues with the camping grounds, and we do work closely with them when there are big events coming to town. For example, the camping ground at Tahuna is given a discretionary permit so they can actually expand out into the Tahuna Sports Ground. They are supportive of the recommendation.
Any further, Councillor Wilson?
My question about the discretionary, getting what the phrase was, section 5 was discretionary council consent. Can you explain the 4 weeks required turnaround for that, and who exercises that discretion, and how many people are warranted for that?
The delegation sits at my level and anybody above me to sign that off. The 4 weeks turnaround is a guideline, and I can assure you that they usually turn around in 24 hours.
And it's just that I think a lot of people wouldn't be organised 4 weeks out necessarily to for this, and I'm just wondering if that is too long. Appreciating that sometimes people are allowed holidays, but generally.
Councillor, is this a question?
It is a question. Given the market of people coming and who would be wanting to do this, I think most people would be happy to go to camping grounds. It's generally, there'd be an unplanned stoppage.
So the majority of discretionary, we gave out 12 last year, and the majority were quite far out from when they intended to stay. They do tend to be well planned and often the same people every year in the same different areas. However, if there were circumstances, by all means, staff would work to accommodate people so they could enjoy the reserves.
Councillor Mapping.
Very much. If we were to adopt the first option and basically outlaw freedom camping without self-contained vehicles, do you believe this is going to result in a change of behaviour or of the type of vehicle that gets used?
I believe that the type of vehicles that are coming into the city now will continue to come into the city. I think that they will be captured in the new education program, and the message will come across. There is the campers that come in, they know where they can and cannot camp at the moment, and that will be communicated through this new bylaw. There is the risk of infringements and changes again at that national level to make vehicles be tagged rather than people be tagged. It does have quite a powerful effect on people travelling. But first and foremost, we want people coming here to know where they can and can't go rather than having to do enforcement.
What are the total number of tent sites at the camping grounds in the city?
I don't have that information at hand at the moment, but I can get it for you.
You have a rough idea what it is? Is it more than 150?
No, but I do know that they're not at capacity. In the communication we've had with the camping grounds, they have capacity to take additional visitors.
But we haven't resolved an actual, well, I guess what I'm saying is if we believe that it could be as many as 150 non-self-contained vehicles arriving just at the Warrington Domain alone in this next upcoming season, and we don't allow them to camp there, we have to accommodate 150 tent sites, and do we have a clear understanding of our relationship to that potential number?
Given this isn't just a Dunedin issue, it's a national issue, and responding to the question about the types of vehicles coming in, we believe there will be a change in people in making decisions about the types of vehicles that they rent, with the shifting away from the current vehicles being self-contained to no longer being self-contained. So we do think that there will be a change there. In terms of the exact numbers that are available, again, Given the apps, given the ability to communicate with people, our feeling is that in general people will be well informed in advance of what their options are and what their choices are. So in terms of the volumes of people coming in, they will know what their options are in the city for that day.
Could you foresee a possibility then that their option will be to get a fine or not come to Dunedin at all because the campsites are full?
Make their choices.
And they can go where at that point?
There are 9 camping grounds across the city. We have our Where Can I Camp brochure that is widely distributed that points out to people where they can and cannot stay.
Okay. no point in belaboring this point any further, but related to that point, are we going to be assessing, or will the campgrounds be assessing the use of these campsites once we bring in this bylaw, if we bring in this bylaw change? Because we are hearing that by having the current bylaw, we are taking business away from these campsites. The counterside to that argument, the logical expectation is that in fact they will see significant increase of use of their campsites. So will we be monitoring that, and will we get a report back on the change of use of those campsites if we go with option 1?
Certainly, as with all bylaw implementation, we will be monitoring it. As with the changes that we made to the last bylaw, there was a report back to the council post the camping season that identified the issues that we found, and with some recommendations for changes in the following summer. We obviously made some physical changes at some of the camping sites in the last summer. So yes, it's certainly our intention to keep in touch with the campgrounds to monitor areas of potential issues, and we will report back to the council at the end of the camping season.
Excellent. Now, in a forward-thinking question, if we do change the behaviour of, or the type of vehicle used, and we end up with more self-contained vehicles, what's the economic impact on us in terms of septic tank dump sites? So presumably we'd have to put more in if we have more self-contained vehicles coming up.
We can't foresee what that impact is, but if it's identified as an issue and something we need to address, that will be covered in the council report to council.
It would be an interesting cash expenditure to compare the cost of doing that versus more toilets. If we go to this area, and if we adopt option number 1, we have an anticipated level of increased enforcement. What is the increased expected expenditure on that increased enforcement?
So the status quo is estimated to be about $37,000 a year. If we go into the new, we would propose having an additional route every day. We would have that for the first 3 months and then monitor it. If we needed it for the full camping season, an estimate of around $80,000. Last year we had revenue, and that is offset partially by revenue from infringements.
And I do want to touch on something that Councillor Wilson brought up in terms of the permits. If this enforcement was in today and someone decided it's a lovely day today and I'd like to go out to Warrington and put up a tent, are they likely to get a fine? Because it seems unlikely they'll be able to get a permit in time.
Staff would do everything in their power to ensure that they could put up a tent and get a permit in time.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just touching base on one of the questions that Councillor O'Malley asked. When Mr Morrison came and presented on behalf of the Waikowai Community Board, he talked about the highest day being 157 vehicles, camps, cars, tent sites. Overall, there was a combination of self-contained and non-self-contained.
Yes.
Okay. And when we look at whether it's Warrington or Ocean View, self-contained vehicles will still be permitted?
Yes, they will.
Okay. And then listening to Mr Brown earlier today, can you just elaborate on some of the points he made about the submitters?
So just for clarification, Mr Brown commented that at the deliberations there was more people against option 1 being recommended than for. We received 250 written submissions and 17 people were heard. 10 people supported the option 1, which is what is recommended today. There was 6 people opposed option 1 and 1 person that was neutral.
Were the 6 that opposed, were any of them members of the community board, or?
It was 3 from one community board and 1 from another community board.
So out of the 6, 4 were related to community boards?
But I must note that there was, in the 4 side, there was also a community board member there.
Okay.
I just have a point of order that, Your Worship. 3 community boards presented that day because I went and watched it. And they were all in opposition. So I don't understand how you got 2 community boards there when the Peninsula Community Board, Saddle Hill Community Board and the Waikowai Coast Community Board all presented and all supported option 3.
The Saddle Hill and the Wekawaiti were against, but the Peninsula Board was in support of option 1. And that is in the minutes from the deliberation.
This, again, we're looking at this bylaw being more of a national approach. So if November 1 kicks in, how does that fit with North Otago, South Otago, Central Otago? Have they already implemented this, or are they in the process?
So north of the Waitaki, this is their current process, similar to Canterbury, is certified self-contained only. Clutha is currently in review. They're looking to do something very, very similar to us, and they're doing a few complicated things with Southland District around having joint enforcements, which are looking to deal with the Catlins area, which is a lot more remote than some of the areas we deal with. Central Otago, a lot of their issues that they have is based on LINZ land, so they have different agreements with LINZ, although they have in recent times, and they were present at the meeting in September. They are looking at how they would pull together a bylaw to support those NZTA and LINZ agreements. Queenstown has the same certified self-contained. They're slightly more restricted than us in the fact they don't allow any certified self-contained in urban areas, and they don't have the ability for discretionary permits at all.
So really, for anybody travelling south of Christchurch, we will be very consistent with what is happening.
Yes, actually south of Tasman and Nelson. So Tasman and Nelson also used to allow for non-certified self-contained, as did Canterbury up until last Christmas. And they have since changed bylaws or amended or in the process of amending bylaws to only allow certified self-contained camper vans.
And in the North Island, what's the movement?
I couldn't tell you all of them, but the majority, some of the people involved at that national forum are Whangarei, Thames, Coromandel. Wellington has had a very open bylaw and has been having some issues at the moment. They've been seeking some assistance from the national group and from some of the likes of ourselves for some advice on how to approach a bylaw.
So really,
Tauranga.
Yep. So really, we're very much going to be in line with what the rest of the country's doing. So if we move past this today, someone coming to visit is not going to be, oh my God, Dunedin's totally different, or anything like that. It's going to be very much a similar process. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Hi. I've got a number of questions. A lot of people who come here and Freedom Camp don't actually rent a car. They buy a car, put a mattress in the back and travel around. New Zealand is seen as one of the more expensive countries in which to travel for young people, and so this is a way of saving money. Hence the increase around New Zealand and the problems. And I was just wondering where these people will go in these little cars with mattresses in the back, and where do you think they will go if they can't go to Ocean View and Warrington?
So they will be being referred to camping grounds.
Do we know the capacity of our camping grounds within the Dunedin area?
Councillor, that question's been specifically asked a moment ago.
Oh, okay. Do we have the capacity, like for at Tahuna, to actually create some more space for these people?
That is something that the camping ground operators would have to determine, whether there was the demand there, and if there was a demand, whether they had, whether it was economically viable for them to extend their camping grounds, if possible.
And the other question was, this is a nationwide problem, I understand that. What moves nationally at the meeting you went to is DOC making in this space?
So DOC around the country has a number of DOC campsites. They have a number in Fiordland and up around the Tasman and the Coromandel. They don't have many south of Christchurch that's outside Fiordland, and they are aware of that, and have regular discussions with the local DOC office here about looking at areas and options to work in a collaborative way to create a DOC campsite. But at this stage there is nothing cement that I can report for the Dunedin area.
So potentially we have within our City Council some lands that maybe we could work with DOC on to create something?
Not that we've identified at this stage.
Thank you.
Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Your Worship. My concern is I understand the fact that we'll be towing the party line and doing what the rest of the country seems to be doing. I just don't know if that's necessarily the right thing. My concern is if we limit the amount of yes, there is. Yeah, it's coming. I knew you. If we limit, these non-self-contained camping people, how the hell are we going to enforce them? Because they're just going to run for the hills. They're going to drive 2 kilometres down the road. The sort of people we're talking about are not the sort of people who have budgeted for camping grounds up and down the country. What they have done is, as my colleague said, is bought a car, thrown a mattress in the back and gone for a ride. So how are we going to possibly enforce this? Aren't we just making the problem disappear from set areas and spreading it right across the province?
Through education and through our enforcement, and we have 120 odd people across the city that jump on the phone and give us a call if there are clusters of people camping where they shouldn't be on a very regular basis. It really does come down to that education first and foremost, and I think we're lucky with how far technology has come since freedom camping was first sort of put on the table back in 2011, and we do have the ability to get right into those people's cars basically via their phones and communicate that this is a consistent approach, and this is how Dunedin is dealing with non-certified self-contained vehicles. And once that message starts to become wider, it gives people the ability to make choices when they do come to Dunedin on whether they go for a car or whether they do rent a certified van and have more freedom on where they can pull up and park, or they need to build into their budgets to stay at camping grounds or other accommodation providers.
Councillor Steedman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just in regards to the bylaw itself, to get some consistency, was this bylaw taken from another council by chance?
No, it's basically the exact same bylaw that we have had with the removal of Schedule C, which makes allowances for non-certified self-contained vehicles. It is a very similar bylaw to other councils, though.
Second question, just in relation to pricing, we've got 7 places in Dunedin, you said, is that right? 9. Have you guys gone round and got the pricing off them and got an indication if, business did ramp up for them, whether pricing might drop to actually invigorate the Freedom campers to go there, possibly?
We have done that exercise with the pricing. I don't have it at hand, but can provide it, and there are most definitely discussions we can have with the camping ground operators, but it would ultimately be their decisions.
Sorry, third question. I just wonder if it, it might be that an advantage to them if they did, offer a cheaper rate to Freedom campers to take the pressure off our city as well, is the reason why as well, possibly.
Are there any other questions? No further questions, right. Well, I'll invite the chair of the hearing panel, Councillor Wiley, to move this, as he's indicated he wishes to, and to speak to it in the first instance.
Thank you, Your Worship. This was a...
I need a second. A seconded, Councillor Garrett, sorry.
As it was previously stated, freedom camping and camping control bylaw has been a very hot topic over the last few years. And when we had 250 submissions on this topic and 17 speakers, it really did indicate what the community was saying, what they wanted us to do, and which direction we wanted to go. 74% of them wanted option 1, 5.2% wanted option 2, 14.4% wanted option 3, and 6.4% had no option. Then when we came to the speakers, it really did, they did come out and say they wanted option 1. So what I would like everybody to do is think about the community, think about what the community has asked us to do. The staff have had a huge challenge with this. They've put a lot of work with it, and they have really worked hard with everybody across our community. I don't think we could have done any more in the way of engagement. I don't think we could have done any more in trying to support all groups with their views. I think when it comes down to it, option 1 is what the community wants. And I think that is going to be extremely important. Obviously, Wakawai Community, Coastal Community Board are quite vocal in this area. So during the hearing process, I took the opportunity to break down the submissions from that region. And there, by my recollection, looking at the postal codes on the spreadsheet, 48 wanted option 1. That was 48 out of 62. 2 wanted option 2. 8 wanted option 3, and 4 were non-specific. So out of the Wakawai Coast Community Board, 48 out of 62 want option 1. We've heard from the Wakawai Coast Community Board. We totally understand what issues they've been going through. And I think now is the time to move forward in the best interest of the whole city. And so my option will be option 1. Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'm going to struggle to support this, I think, because of a number of concerns that I have, both with the content of it and the process that has led us here. I have concerns around enforcement. As we've heard, it's not illegal to rest in your car on the side of the road, and we can have a series of semantic arguments between our warranted officers and people as to whether they're resting or sleeping if we wish, but it hardly seems like the best use of anybody's time. We've been told that this proposed option will make it easier to manage across the city, and we've heard nothing really to back that up, that a scattered population will be easier to manage than a population in a couple of areas where we're expecting them to be. I have concerns around the permit process, not just because of the logistics involved in the turnaround time, but I think it always puts staff in an unfortunate position where they're being asked to use their discretion as to decide who can or can't use council land. And I think it unfortunately feeds into something we've heard a lot in this debate over the years, this kind of locals only attitude, where to hear some people tell it as long as you hold a New Zealand passport, you'd never dare go so far as to bespoil our natural environment, which kind of plays into our 100% pure fantasy, I suppose. And obviously, since we've stopped freedom camping in McAndrew Bay, no rubbish or mess or anything has been found in the surrounds where people used to stay there. I find it disappointing in terms of process to be asked to make a decision based on the information that we have in the papers in front of us. All we are told is that a majority supported, and we've had some fine quantitative analysis on the submissions from the mover, but it's not a numbers game. 20 weak arguments can be defeated by one good one, but it's hard to assess the calibre of the arguments that were made during this process based on the papers that we have. We're essentially being asked to rubber stamp the panel's recommendation, which was in line with a proposal from staff that very much steered us in this direction, and I think that's a shame. But most importantly, I think my concern is that we're playing a game here of good tourist, bad tourist. We've just signed off a draft festival and events strategy that's aimed at attracting visitors to our city. We spend millions of dollars every year on staff and on advertising and on events aimed at attracting visitors to our city. We've enthusiastically got behind the national level drives through Tourism New Zealand and others to double tourism in our country and attract our fair share of them to the city. And I feel like what we're doing here is saying that we don't have the infrastructure to cope with the exponential growth of the tourism industry, but rather than addressing the infrastructure problems, we're using the size of a visitor's wallet as a proxy for who we should be welcoming here. And I think that is something that we should all be concerned about. The idea of going for the better tourist or going for the higher value tourist and becoming essentially a playground for the rich. And that's not a country that I want to live in, and it's certainly not something that would make us one of the world's great small cities, in my opinion. I'm not convinced that this is the solution to the problems that have arisen. We've heard that the current framework that we're operating under has seen a reduction in infringements over time. I'm not convinced that we need to change that, regardless of what more or less hospitable territorial local authorities in the wider region may be doing in terms of regulating this issue. So I won't be supporting this, and foreshadow that should this fail, I'll move to support the status quo. Thanks.
Councillor Elder.
One of the things that I was concerned about was if this goes ahead, that there is a review put in place to see how it worked or what the process is around there, and that would be straight after the holiday season or camping season. So if it were to go ahead, I would want that to be in the calendar, please.
Councillor Vandervis.
I would like to support everything that Councillor Hawkins has very eloquently put forward. I accept that Councillor Wiley has done what he can to ascertain what the community wants, and that is option one. But as I see it, what the community wants is actually not available. I agree with Councillor Hawkins that the idea that staff have that it will be easier to manage a dispersed group of campers is simply not realistic. It's beyond optimistic. The idea that somehow we can take 30,000 visitors from all points of the globe, a lot of them Europe, and give them some sort of education, and then those that won't be educated deal with them by enforcement, may be something that the community wants, but again, it's not something that's going to happen. Regarding the permit issue, for those of you who would like an enlightening read about permits, Bob Jones wrote a very entertaining book called The Permit. Not his best perhaps, but still highly entertaining and definitely worth a read. Again, public servants' faith in the effectiveness of permits is something which, in the real world, is often not found. So, in option one, much as an all, I'd kind of like to vote for it if it could work. I don't believe that it has a snowball's chance in today's weather or anywhere else of succeeding. I don't think that education enforcement are anywhere going to be possible. But I very much appreciate that Ms. Patterson has essentially encapsulated the problem that we have when she says the problem basically is where you can and cannot go. If you've ever taken a bunch of kids camping and you have to decide where they can and cannot go, you'll realise that there comes a point where some of the kids just have to go, and then where they go becomes kind of secondary, really. I believe that if we go for option one, and even though the rest of the country may be heading that way as well, that we will actually be making something of a mistake. First of all, it won't be enforceable. Second of all, the education hoped for won't happen. Third of all, people are going to go anyway. And then if you look at option two, the disadvantage that we won't be consistent with neighbouring local authorities, I would actually see it as an advantage if we were to be more welcoming and more friendly as an authority. Queenstown's obviously got more guests than it can handle anyway. Let us have the benefit of them. So I do have sympathy for what's hoped for in option one. I just don't think that in reality it will be achievable. And therefore, certainly in the meantime, and I'd love to see the opportunity of how things pan out over the next holiday season. If we were to just stick with option two, we learned a lot from the very large numbers that we had, especially at Warrington in the last season, and I think that we are better able to accommodate them now. If we were to go for Councillor Hawkins's foreshadowed option two, and just look at how that panned out this year, I would then feel a lot more comfortable about looking at some other system next year, perhaps. To me, to jump on the bandwagon that everyone else seems to be getting onto is just a little bit precipitous. I think that the optimism that this option one is going to work is not something that I can share. And I like the idea of us just giving it another chance for another season and seeing what happens then. So on that basis, I recommend option two for anyone who happens to be swinging. Thank you.
Councillor Garrett.
First of all, I want to acknowledge the Wakawaishi Community Board and Saddle Hill Community Board because they have made our visitors welcome. And I want to thank the staff because our staff are considered ahead of the game nationally on this matter. And I don't think around the table, colleagues, that we perhaps appreciate that. We're actually leading the way as opposed to jumping on the bandwagon. About the visitors, these are wonderful young people, often from all over the world, or New Zealand retirees, in fact, a large proportion of them. And yes, we want to make them welcome to come and see our wildlife, for example, which I might add is impacted by large numbers of visitors, and that is becoming a concern. We can do both, welcoming the visitors and managing freedom camping. I've had 10 years' experience in local government on this. I've had 2 years on national executive. We are not alone in this issue at all. I've lived this in the area that I live in. I've fronted meetings of angry residents, and it's the most polarising thing. And once you get it to that point, there isn't really any way of going back. And there is a way to get through this. I've also lived through 3 bylaws, and I can say that they have been reviewed regularly. The enforcement has improved substantially from when we started and is in fact successful. The permit process has worked, and I have confidence that option one will work. I like to think that we can share our piece of paradise with the world, but unfortunately it sadly isn't so, because we do have some folk in the community who don't share that view. And it's the sheer numbers of visitors that have changed this. And we need to acknowledge that. One of the things that's really important for our visitors is that they're very clear, that it's a very clear message. I hired a camper van in Northland some years ago with my family, and what struck me was how difficult it was to get information in those days, and how on earth would visitors understand what the bylaws were in each area when in fact the local people didn't either. And a very clear, consistent message is important. So in fact, having a bylaw that is consistent with adjacent areas is really relevant and important. yes, it is important to take the community with us, and there are some that will not be happy with going down the avenue of option 1. But I know from the work that the staff have done and that I've worked with them on over time, and in the last bylaw, the area that I lived in and was advocating for, we worked really hard to get a bylaw that would work for our area, and the difference between now and then is huge. If we leave things as they are, what is going to happen is that members in the community who aren't particularly happy about the number of visitors or about freedom camping, people get very obsessed with this, might I say. It's going to be nasty, it's going to be messy, and it is not going to be welcoming to our visitors at all. Option 1 is workable. The world won't end if we vote for it. In fact, I believe it will be very positive and successful because of the work the staff have done. It's enforceable, and the visitors will know what is expected of them. So I will be supporting option 1, and I would like to acknowledge all of the work that the staff have done to get us to this point and the preparation for the possibility of a bylaw change.
Councillor O'Malley.
I think it's fairly obvious to say that I'm not going to be supporting option 1. Having been on the Waikawaiti Community Board and only been on this council for a year, I got onto that board and the freedom camping issue was probably the very first thing that I was introduced to. And at that time, we were also told of plans of looking at other sites, and those sites that were mentioned, I fed back to staff at that very meeting that I felt that they would be contentious, and the most notable of that was Rotary Park. And I don't know how Rotary Park got chosen because of its very close proximity to houses. It was almost always guaranteed to get the level of response that it did. And I feel that the response to choosing that site has somewhat inflamed what was already a fairly bad sore. The Waikawaiti Community Coastal Community Board, had a meeting at Warrington about 9 months ago where we were asked by the people of that community, what are you going to do about it? And I said, have faith in us. We will do our best to try to figure out how to take the tension off your area. And at that meeting, we just off the top of our head came up with 12 potential sites, which we lodged in the minutes of the meeting. We didn't hear back on those sites until they appeared in a report just before council where all of them were rejected. I have felt during this period that what we were trying to do at Warrington as a community board that oversaw that area was to engage in a process of how to do this in a way that it was managed. It was clear that this needed to be shared across the city and that the burden couldn't be put on just 1 or 2 places. And in many respects, that was what the chair of the Saddle Hill Community Board said at the public forum. There was no opposition and still remains no opposition to the existing freedom camping site at Brighton. It was the issue of putting in an additional one there when no other region of the city was going to have to be asked for one, which got the pushback. I would like council to start thinking along a different line, and instead of feeling that it's our obligation to come up with some answer and all done on our land and only through our bylaws, that we go and take into account all of the key players here, the camping grounds, the community boards, councillors who want to be involved, and anybody else who has land, and see whether or not we can actually approach this from another direction and say, where could we put these people? Because I believe if we go for option 1, it's just going to be where we were 3 years ago. And we're just going to go back to the same point. And Councillor Gary talks about the success of what happened in McAndrew Bay. Well, that was because all those campers got directed over to Warrington. Now we're going to undirect them. So I hope that the ladies and gentlemen of McAndrew Bay, when they start seeing these camper vans arrive, know how to get hold of Councillor Gary, because I believe there's going to be vans back there again, as they're going to be everywhere again. Prohibition and policing is a comfortable place to go when you're annoyed, but it has never ever worked on almost any front ever. And I believe that we're going to see failure here, and that we're just going to be back visiting this again. So I do want to also bring up Councillor Elder's point. I believe that if option 1 does pass, I would like us to also make sure we go back and revisit this in 1 year's time. But I will be voting for option 2.
Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Worship. I'd just like to also thank the staff and the subcommittee for the work that they've done, because obviously this is a very contentious issue, and I don't want you all feeling like you've been got at today. However, I think I won't be able to support option 1. I think it's a very, very blunt tool. As Councillor Gary said, it's nasty and messy. Well, nasty and messy to me is rather than having all these campers in one place, we're going to have them all over our province, hiding from enforcement. When they know there's a $200 fine, they're not exactly going to park in their most findable places. I think it's going to be nigh on impossible to enforce this bylaw as it is at the moment. At the moment, where they're parking, at least we know where they are, and they're easier to get hold of. So if we change that, we're going to be chasing them all over the shop. I look forward, obviously, to a tech-based solution. I think there are many, many options. I agree with Councillor O'Malley as well, that we should be doing more to host these people, not necessarily in the centre of town, but on the outskirts. We're talking fresh water and a toilet. I think the difference, education is one thing, but the difference between purchasing one car for $500 in Auckland and driving it down the length of their country and looking for accommodation every single night is that just, you know, miles apart. And I mean, a self-contained camper is more cost prohibitive again. So I just think it's a lovely ambition, but I just don't think it's going to happen. So I will, I can't support option 1, and if option 1 falls over, I will be looking at option 2.
Councillor Steedman.
Thank you, Worship. Yeah, it's interesting listening to all the discussions. One thing to bear in mind is we're actually here to represent the ratepayer, and I listened to Councillor Wiley on the numbers that were given out. We're here representing the community and what they actually want, and there was a lot of submissions. Something to bear in mind too is, my offside here, Councillor Newell, I'd like to see $500 cars actually taken off the road, to be fair, if they're driving from Auckland down to Dunedin, because they're just a hazard as well. So, you know, I'm going to listen to what the ratepayers actually have wanted in the submissions to the committee, so I'll be supporting option 1. Thank you.
The speakers. Okay, I will make... Oh, Councillor Laufisa.
Thank you, Your Worship. I won't be supporting this recommendation. I go back to earlier in the year. I thought that the status quo was working sweetly, and that we would eventually work out with, particularly with the Waikoiti Community Board, options for supporting their willingness to work with us in terms of accommodating people. I just want to recall that we were talking about appealing to central government in terms of a visitor's tax or whatever to take care of infrastructure demands, because, as His Worship said during the break, we can't afford infrastructure to provide, you know, public toilets for our own people, let alone visitors. And I think you know, that when the staff brought this back from the national meeting where the Tauranga District Council was going to take its bylaw, take its changes, I think it was in the, this is just my maybe weird way of looking at it, but I think it was in the spirit of a very depressing 9 years of national government. And I think with the change in political government, and maybe we could see our way to actually lobbying harder, maybe via LGNZ, for that visitors tax, and not stress out so much about the lack of infrastructure. But I think to send people to camping grounds undermines totally the principle and the outlook of freedom camping. And I still always remember what Councillor O'Malley told us, or he read the papers more thoroughly, is that other Kiwis, other New Zealanders, are the third largest group of Kiwi freedom campers, and I think we have to fight to preserve that. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
I found it very interesting to listen to all of the debate today, and I had hoped that Councillor Benson Pope, who was also on the hearings panel, was going to speak, so I've held off to hear what he had to say. I've sat through 3 hearings on this, and every time it's not a easy discussion, because it's the people who will come forward are the ones that are affected at that time. And I cannot forget the very first one that I sat on, where people were complaining about people in the town belt parking up, which is, I think, what we will end up, and we will have gone full circle with this proposed change. There is absolutely no right answer. And while we've got the current legislation, and I've just been looking up the Wicked website, because Wicked I think, are possibly the proponents who, the company that has the biggest issue. And this is what they've got to say on their site. The New Zealand government are like Nazis on campers parking and sleeping by roadsides. They find people like crack addicts smoke crack. That's the type of language they're using about this. That's not helpful at all. They don't have one vehicle with a toilet or a shower in it. And they're going out there with vehicles that are well under 50% hireage of any other self-contained vehicle. That is the issue. That is the problem. It has got nothing to do with any bylaw that's written. So what's the end result? I fear that if we accept the advice, and it's given an absolutely good heart, and I accept absolutely the responsibility of being on that panel, having done it 3 times, but I think you're going to exacerbate a problem, and it's actually going to become more costly if we do adopt option 1. Because people like Wicked are still out there promoting their product. They're saying they're the cheapest, they're saying they can guarantee you a good time, and they will do whatever it does to hire their vans out. That is the issue, and it doesn't matter what we do today. But we are going to have some negative results if we accept option 1. I'm sorry, I think I've almost been convinced by my colleagues. I wasn't sure how I was going to vote on this today. I actually think we have to have a policy which we try and manage these things, and it is going to take some more work.
Any further speakers? Okay. For my part, there's been quite a lot of discussion about whether or what will work. And I think it would be naive of any of us to think that anything will work perfectly. Nothing will work perfectly. The status quo doesn't work at the moment. Option 1 won't work perfectly either, nor will option 2 or option 3. So, as is the case in many of these situations, we have to choose what we feel is best given all the other circumstances. Can I just go back to the origins of the freedom camping debate, 2011, when we had the Rugby World Cup, and the government realised that there'd be an enormous number of people travelling the country, that many of them, because we were a stadium in 10 places or whatever it was, that a lot of those people would be in camper vans. They were in camper vans. There were very few, at that time, non-self-contained vehicles. But as we encouraged freedom camping, the companies, rather like the ones that Councillor Wilson referenced, saw an opportunity and no penalty and put in non-self-contained vehicles. And they have proliferated, and really they are the problem, not, as you've said, Councillor Wilson. But insofar as we've encouraged non-self-contained vehicles, you end up with 2 situations possible. One is that if you encourage non-self-contained vehicles all over the place, and that's pretty much the status quo, then you're going to have a lot of human waste all over the place. The alternative to that is to put in toilets all over the place. And I would argue that neither of those situations is sustainable. The first is a cost in terms of our environment. The second is a cost in terms of investment. And can I repeat that the reason we have more of the non-self-contained campers is that we encourage them. You know, it perhaps was done slightly unconsciously, but that's what we did. And so in terms of the environmental cost, this is not about rights and wrongs, it's about behaviour. It doesn't actually matter who's crapping in the bush, it's crap. And that is a big part of the problem, and it's certainly a big part of the problem around the rest of the country. Now, if we say, well, we have to offer some places for these people to be, then we come into basically it's an economic development argument. We have to provide toilets if that's what we want to do. First of all, we've got to find the places. Now, I would respectfully disagree with some of my colleagues. We have looked pretty hard, and there are not many places around Dunedin, and there's certainly not many places that a good number in our community wouldn't object to. So I'd suggest that it's going to be very, very difficult to find places where we could put a toilet, even if we wanted to. Secondly, as Councillor Laufiso has pointed out, we have difficulty funding toilets for our own people in sufficient numbers for their needs, let alone putting them in for people who are not paying for the service in competition with camping grounds who are paying us commercial rates and probably objecting to that. But insofar as it's an economic development argument, you can say, okay, what are these people bringing to the community? Does that, into our community in terms of funding, does that justify us investing in infrastructure? And you work it out. So even if the figure I heard the other day was $83 a day for non-self-contained campers, that's what they spend in the community. The amount that council would get out of that $83 a day wouldn't clean a single toilet, let alone pay for the capital cost in the first place, the depreciation, the cleaning, and goodness knows what else. It's pitiful. So I go back to the fact that we are faced with an unsustainable situation if we don't do something to control non-self-contained campers. So it's a difference between an unsustainable situation at the moment and an imperfect situation that we're proposing, option one. And I would point out that what it has in its favour is consistency with the rest of New Zealand. I don't altogether agree with Councillor Vandervis when he says that, well, if Queenstown doesn't want them, we want them all here. If the rest of the South Island has one rule and we have another, and they all come here, I think we'll be back in this chamber within a year, desperate to find a way out of the situation that we've got ourselves into by not listening to our community. Our community has quite clearly said to us, we don't think this is sustainable, we do not want this in our community, and here we all are, second-guessing them, and saying, oh, no, you don't know what's right for you. We know what's better for you. We know what's sustainable. Our community has spoken. And more than that, I don't think the situation that we've got is sustainable. We don't have the places. We can leave the status quo. Where are they going to go? We haven't got the places. We haven't got the toilets. The next season is going to be mayhem. So even if it were only in the short term, I think we would have to go with option one just to handle what we've got. Councillor Wiley, your right of reply. Sorry? Well, I asked a moment ago if anyone wanted to speak. Right, well, up to you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I, as you know, was a member of the bylaw hearing panel, and I think the way the process has operated here has not helped us come to a good public policy decision. I don't think there's any doubt, as has been mentioned, that the well-equipped, articulate owners of laser printers in Connell Street did help inflame the issue, and I agree that the Rotary Park suggestion was not a sensible or helpful suggestion. It was, however, made at the request of this council, which asked staff to try and find other places that would enable us to help accommodate and welcome freedom campers. And what this process, and I'll come back to the process in a moment, what this has led to is in fact the worst of both worlds, because the other option that was originally canvassed by the bylaws process was the option that we enhance the status quo by providing other facilities such as the kind that Councillor O'Malley alluded to in other locations, and resource them. As other speakers have said, I don't think this problem is going to go away, and I don't doubt that we'll be revisiting it. But what concerns me more is that the numbers involved will disperse. I'm sure they are not going to disappear. A lot of them have probably already bought their plane tickets and got their cheap vehicle lined up. They're going to be here. And the other conundrum that the community in the public process didn't have to grapple with is what our law says about whether you can park on the street and sleep in a vehicle or not. And I think that is extremely problematic. And so I think in public policy terms, it's not always best to have a vote that is weighted according to the numbers. And in fact, as Mr. Brown said in the public forum, there were a lot of very thoughtful, extensive submissions from some of our ratepayers and community boards indeed, who have supported what we've done and wanted to encourage it further. So I won't be supporting option 1. I voted against option 1 at the committee. I don't think that is the best way forward. I'd like to see us as a community being more welcoming to visitors and coping with the issues in a rational way rather than trying to divert or stem a flow of people who are not able to or choose not to spend as much as those who rent other vehicles. I noticed with interest the costs of the camping sites that we are proposing to send these people to. They're not cheap. They're 20 to 30 or more plus extras. A tent site at one of our local campsites, maximum 8 people, is $40 for the site, plus $20 an adult. So we're not going to be sending these people to camping sites, most of them. They're going to be hiding in Highgate, perhaps, or Leaf Valley, I don't know. And I think it would have been a better option had we come to a recommendation that enhanced the number and the simple facilities at a few more sites around town.
Councillor Wiley.
It's definitely been an interesting debate today. But again, I want to re-emphasise, I think the staff have done a great job and where we've got to, and I think that's the key thing we can all agree on at this table. The Mayor summed it up really well, and I really appreciated the words he said. He's a lot more articulate than I am, so it was a good way to put it together. The one thing that I've consistently heard, in some people's minds, it's like this is a ban on freedom camping. We're not banning freedom camping. This is about people coming to our city in self-contained vehicles and getting to enjoy their visit in a self-contained vehicle and staying at Warrington, staying at Ocean View and staying at other areas. They're great. They're going to be totally looked after. We've got to think about the non-self-contained. That's what this argument is really all about. And this is what this vote is about. We've heard from Councillor Benson Pope, who said he didn't support it the first time. Great. And it was interesting to hear, how he felt that I guess the way I see it, he's feeling the results were skewed in the submissions. The community have been pretty consistent right across the board in talking about what they want and how they want the council to support them. And actually, it is about creating a greater and an improved destination for everyone. But it's also about improving our residents. I don't know about you people, but I was elected by the residents. And we're here for the residents. Residents first. So I figure this debate's going to be very close, and I want the 3 or 4 of you who sort of haven't been totally convinced to think about how you're going to look the resident in the eye and you're going to communicate them your message. The other part is Dunedin will be open to freedom camping for self-contained vehicles. That's a given. We've heard that over and over again. We will continue to welcome these people, but the bylaw is all about, ensuring that we will create a uniform destination with the rest of the South Island. Now, to think, okay, a lot of the commentary that some of you have put forward today, well, a lot of these people aren't even going to travel across Cook Strait because they're going to see that they can't sleep where they want to in the South Island. So I'm sorry, I really struggled with your arguments in that sense because we've heard that consistently. This is in line with the rest of the South Island. So think about that for a minute. What are we going to say? Oh yeah, they say the campground here will do this all the way down. Oh, when they get to Dunedin, we give them an open season. Go for it. I struggle with that. So getting in line with our neighbours, supporting our neighbours, and having a unified plan. When you have a submission from the Warrington Surf Club who support option 1, they don't support what the community board wanted. You know, they are a key part of the asset of that community. They want option 1. Then we listen to about the enforcement. How will this happen? You know, it won't work. All this sort of rhetoric. When you look at these travellers and when you talk to them, we can change the bylaw on November 1 and 90% plus of them will understand exactly what's going on because of the apps, the Campermate and these other apps that they use. So it won't be the barriers that some of you think are going to be an issue. So what I want to finish on is let's do what the residents want us to do in this city. Let's really work with them and let's support option 1 and let's have a consistent approach also with our neighbours around the South Island. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take this by division, please.
Councillor Benson Pope. No. Councillor Elder. No. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hawkins. No. Councillor Lafiso. No. Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Councillor Newell.
No.
Councillor O'Malley.
No.
Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Councillor Steedman.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
Aye.
Councillor Wilson. Please.
No.
Your Worship.
Aye. 6-8.
6-8, lost, sorry.
Okay, we'll move on now to item 22. Thank you. Wiley is...
In light of us rejecting that, do we even need to move something that is the existing bylaw? And I'm happy to move it.
No, it's there.
It stands.
Sorry?
It stands.
What are you agreeing to, Sandy?
It stands. It's not changed, so it stands, I think.
For fear of there being any doubt, I'm happy to move option 2.
Bear with us. Bear with. Okay, the advice is that the status quo prevails and we don't need to reinforce it. So, item 22, your notice of motion, Councillor Hawkins. Thank you, Jendi. Thank you, Ruth.
It hasn't been seconded.
I'll second it.
Seconded by
Seconded, Councillor Vandervis. Can we have the notice of motion up on the screen, please, Lynn? We only need 1 second, but we need 2 motions. Right. I think that's as contrasted as it can get. So the motions are on the board, on the wall. Councillor Hawkins, I invite you to speak to your notice of motion.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't intend to take long because it's fairly straightforward, I think. I think despite the arm's length structure of the council's companies and how we interact with them, there's a public expectation, and quite rightfully so, that elected members will ensure that the public's valid questions and concerns are asked and alleviated when they arise. I acknowledge that it won't always be possible to tell our community why we have comfort with the decisions that are made or the conversations that we've had, and that's sort of explained in part 2, really, that I acknowledge that there may be reasons for these conversations to exist in non-public, but I do think that we need to be able to do that with honesty. The catalyst for this, of course, was a discussion that we had around the exit package of a former chief executive of a council-controlled organisation. This isn't about that. That's just how we got to having this conversation. It's not about Mr. Cameron. It's not about levels of executive remuneration. It's about making sure that when issues of public interest arise in companies and assets that are managed, that are owned ultimately by the residents and ratepayers of the city, we can be confident that we can get the responses we need from them. Do we expect detailed figures and names and addresses? No. High-level answers to valid questions would be more than adequate, certainly to satisfy my desires here. I didn't feel it was particularly helpful to be prescriptive as to what this might look like. What I'm hoping will happen is, as a result of this direction from Council, the Holdings Company will come back to us with models or otherwise as to how they might see this working in practice. That may include amendments to the statement of intent, that may include making use of existing or new formal or informal mechanisms of this council. So I expect that will come back to this table for approval at a later date. For us to do that. This isn't I want to make it clear that this isn't a slight on the Holdings Company board or its chair, nor in fact any of their current companies' boards or staff. And certainly this isn't an opportunity, or at least one hopes it doesn't become an opportunity to relitigate and re-air the grievances of the past. I think that certainly the flow of information that we currently enjoy between this body and the Holdings Company board and those that sit under it is far better than it has been. It could always be better, undoubtedly, but we also have no guarantee that it will always remain in as productive a state as it might currently be. So the aim of this motion in part is to make sure this happens in an ongoing fashion, regardless of who's sitting around this table or sitting around their respective board tables. Formalising the mechanisms of communication that we have to be able to have comfort with decisions that are made by residents, asset management companies in their name. And that's what I'm seeking to do here, and I welcome the support for it. Thank you.
Okay, further speakers? Or questions, if there may be some questions you might want to make. I asked the Chief Executive prior to this meeting to just get some legal advice on the implications of this so that we could ask her for that in the event that the motion was made up. So,
but we had a discussion, there's no legal impediment to this. There's a question about whether that was our in-house legal. There's a question about whether this issue would make it difficult for the companies to create an exit arrangement, but that's a policy decision. That's not a legal decision. So, will the benefits you get out of this outweigh the imposition or the difficulty you might place on the directors of the companies should they wish to move on a staff member and have a confidential payout? Your guess is as good as mine about the impact of those things, but it's not a legal issue.
Councillor Lord.
Can I even ask a question, sorry, of the Chief Executive? So my question is, if, and I perhaps see the companies as being quite different to how I see the council, but if you, as Chief Executive of this organisation, have to dismiss someone for poor performance or terminate the contract for whatever reason, and you currently went into an agreement situation where you signed a confidentiality agreement, does that happen? I mean, does that ever happen? Is that a process? And if so, how would you feel if we put this imposition on you? Because I understand that basically pay contracts between an individual and an entity, so the likes of probably you sign or whatever on behalf of the council, and then they sign that employment contract. So how does that stand at the moment? Like, I wouldn't want, for example, if I was one of these staff sitting behind me, for you to have to divulge their pay as an individual. I know within our reporting, the annual report, you've got benchmarks and brackets, but what position would that leave you in if we put you in this situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is, with regard to you and me as the employer of all of the council staff, that is resolutely and firmly in the patch of operational details, and sometimes it is done. There are occasions where most employers will take a pragmatic decision in order to terminate, and people have contractual entitlements. So if you're making arrangements to exit somebody through redundancy or so on, if you're paying outside of people's contractual entitlements, you have to declare them in the annual report. So they become part of the formal record of council, and you would be informed of that, as will the ratepayers. But within those contractual entitlements, they're not. So that will be the same here. I mean, you have found out what the payment is that's caused this notice of motion, because there was a comment in the annual report about pay scale. So that's the other place where you find out the number of people that are getting paid what in an organisation. But a termination payment isn't required to be listed unless it's outside of contractual entitlements.
Councillor O'Malley.
Standing still. I acknowledge what Councillor Hawkins is trying to achieve here, and I applaud that. My question is around the relationship between the shareholder, the board, and employees. Would it be normal, and I guess this reflects our relationship here in terms of our structural relationship with these companies, is it normal for the shareholders to be able to be told about what goes into a contract? Because if it is, then obviously this relates well. If it's not normal, then it doesn't relate. And I would also see that probably option number 2 is where it will all end up being. It would always end up being in the non-public environment, which may mean that we find ourselves now sitting in front of the microphone saying, I can't tell you. In other words, we don't, as a shareholder, we don't have much control over what the board decides to do, and then the board is actually watching the executive hire that person. So we're quite a distance off. I wonder what this is going to do for us, and whether or not a shareholder will be able to ask that.
Would you like a comment from the Chief Executive?
My understanding is that in most instances this wouldn't be something that a shareholder board would be informed about, unless there was something exceedingly unusual. But then confidential payments to senior staff are not uncommon in the private sector, and they have confidentiality clauses. That said, things are different when it is a council-controlled organisation and when it's owned by you on behalf of the ratepayers. In our particular instance, we used to have a shared staff member between a shared chief executive of the companies and a CFO from here, and at that point there might have been able to be a conversation that said, look, it's all kosher, it's all part of the contractual entitlements, nothing here is weird, you know, like that discussion was able to happen. In the absence that now that those discussions can't happen, we don't have that shared position at the moment, and probably not looking to go back to that. So whether there's another mechanism that obtains the same thing, because you are right, once things move, if this is moved, and then the chairman of the holdings company comes and briefs you in confidence about a payout that they've made over which you've had no control, you are then the people that face the media demanding to know what was in the payout, and you'll be the people who are saying, look, I'm sorry, I can't tell you, it's covered by a confidentiality clause, and that puts you in a very difficult position, which is partly why you have a holdings company, to make these difficult decisions within your companies. You may be comfortable with that or you may not, but just being aware that's the change that you'd be making.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
Can I just follow up on that point? Because it seems to me that there's a provision in the second part of this notice that that doesn't necessarily require specific detail. And in the case that you're talking about, would it not be conceivable that while there was no question of any breach of confidentiality, a generic explanation or a generalist comment about how something had proceeded or a situation will meet our needs in a way that we could say, no, I don't know the dollar figure here, but I'm confident that the appropriate procedures were followed, and no confidentiality is therefore breached, and it doesn't produce a difficult situation for us at all, but it does mean that we've got a better chance at credibly monitoring what these companies are doing and extracting assurances or general comment from staff that currently we might not be getting.
If that's what number 2 means, so basically number 2 is saying, look, you're going to come to a non-public part of a relevant meeting and explain why the full details can't be shared because of a confidentiality agreement, but the principles are somebody was paid out within the terms and conditions of their contract, and there was also a requirement to defray legal costs or something like that. Generic details, maybe not even to that level. If you're talking about having that, then we can create wording that means that, and we can send that through to the holdings company.
And I just, I'm anxious to keep this free-flowing and informal because necessarily I think questions and discussion are going to be mixed up a bit here, and I'm not uncomfortable with that. But picking up on your point, Councillor Benson-Pope, I wonder, and this is for the mover, I wonder whether that meaning, in order for that meaning to be taken from 2, that the word can in the second line should be may. Because if you leave can in there, that it basically means that any information that you demand must be given. So I'm just making this a suggestion because I think that is the intent of 2, but it's slightly ambiguous.
That's certainly the intention, and I think Councillor Benson-Pope summed up the tension between plausible deniability and credible monitoring. The challenge we have, though, is that under standing orders, I can't amend this as a notice of motion. That's my understanding.
Sandy, I've got a bit of advice on this. I'm not suggesting that you will necessarily want to, but I need to clarify. Okay.
Oh, we can now. Oh, okay.
You're a decision maker. You can do what you like. Okay. So I'll leave it with you in the meantime. But picking up on Councillor Benson-Pope's explanation of what is really wanted here, and it's pretty difficult to get it into 3 or 4 lines, but I suggest that that word is critical. Now, Councillor Elder.
I was just wondering if you were going to be employed by one of these companies and you knew that that was in place, would it make you feel uneasy, and would that be something that should be of concern to us? That was just something, I mean, we're looking for good people all the time.
Look, it's very difficult to say. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that for the vast majority of employees, when you're seeking employment, you have no intention of doing anything that's going to end up with your termination. I mean, unless you've got somebody who's seriously psychopathic coming and working for you, in which case none of this matters. So when you're originally recruiting, would knowing this at some point down the track cause you to rethink? Look, I don't. It wouldn't bother me, but in some ways I'm probably not a normal employee. I'm a public servant, and these are private sector employees, and who do tend to come into these sort of roles with quite a different sense of their job. Councillor Staines may actually be better pushed, as he sits as directors on a number of companies. He may be better put to answer that question than I.
Feel free to pass an opinion if you wish.
I think what we need to know, firstly we have to trust our holdings company. If we don't trust the board of our holdings company, then we need to do something about it. So firstly, you have to have trust in the board of that company, and that board will stay within the parameters of any contract entered into with their staff member. I think this would be better reversed round, such that if they were to wish to make a settlement that was outside the contract, that they sought approval for us. Like in a public company, these things, so public-private, let's call us public and call the share market private for the sake of clarity. These things will be confidential. There is no doubt about it. And there is no way of discovery. And the shareholder has the ability to vote against board members at an annual general meeting, to throw them out if they didn't like the fact that they had made a decision they didn't agree with. But it didn't give the shareholders of the company access to this information. There'll be a line in a budget somewhere, but that's all it will be. So I personally think we don't need the proposals here. We should have a relationship with our DCHL board that says we should have no surprises. If you are going to make a settlement with an employee, then we need to have confirmed from you that that settlement stays within the bounds of the contract that has been entered into when they were employed. Because otherwise, you will be taking on the responsibility of writing the contract for that employee at the beginning, so that you know that the contract doesn't contain anything that... So a contract's a contract. So my view is we don't need this, but we do need to be able to have a relationship with our DCHL board where we are confident that they will not enter into agreements that are not reasonable, and they will not step outside the contract without informing us of the reasons why.
Right. Now, I need to address process here, particularly as Councillor Staines has come up with another suggestion. My understanding, it has been brought to my attention that there is a provision in the standing orders prohibiting you, as the mover, from changing the notice of motion unless you do it at the time you move. However, the workaround is that if this fails, you can move something else. So if, for instance, two were taken separately and it was the council's will or wish that it fail because it wanted something else, then it can fail, and you can move something with amended wording, and I'd be happy to accept that. The other complication is that what I'm hearing from Councillor Staines is that he is suggesting something different again. So my suggestion for getting around that is you decide whether you want to follow the course I've just outlined and recommend that your second provision fail, and then I'll allow you to move another one with the knowledge that there is an alternative subsequential motion awaiting as well.
Given that, I'm comfortable with us voting on these as they are, and if 2 fails and you're prepared to entertain a second, I'm happy to work with whoever over a brief adjournment to work something up. But I'm not going to recommend that it gets voted down.
Right. It's just that I think what we're pointing out is that as 2 is worded, may put both council and the board in an impossible situation. If all information that is already agreed to be confidential in a contract can be reported to the shareholder, that's an untenable tension that I just don't, conundrum I don't see. If you, I
mean, personally, I don't follow that reading.
Well,
and that's certainly not the intention, but I don't also see how there's the interpretation.
That's my point about suggesting can be substituted with may, because if you take number 1, where it directs the DCHL to limit any confidentiality arrangements such that they don't prohibit that flow of information back to the shareholder, and then you say, but that you acknowledge that that can be done privately, then any information, even that in a contract that has been signed as confidential, then, I mean, it's a contradiction as it stands.
It would be if it said must.
No, can.
Point of order?
Yeah, point of order.
I've got a procedural motion, Mr Chairman, that we suspend standing orders.
Suspend standing orders.
Well, that would enable us to fix this. You could suspend the standing orders, change the wording, and everything's sweet.
Elegant, as always. Second, I don't think you probably can. Seconded, Councillor O'Malley, just to be on the safe side. All those in favour of suspending standing orders, what a splendid suggestion. In favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Do you want that? Would you like that recorded? Yes, please. What a surprise.
And then, Mr. Your Worship, if the mover were to make that change, that he couldn't previously, but now can, and then I would move that we resume standing orders forthwith.
So, I invite you to. So it's just a change of one word.
I'm comfortable with that.
You're right.
Thank you.
So the import of that is that it's the word can becomes may, and that allows for the flexibility that Councillor Benson Pope explained earlier with regard to the divulging of information.
A point of order, Mr Chairman.
Yes.
A procedural motion that we resume standing orders.
Yes, is that word locked in now? We can safely do that, yes. Is there a second to Councillor O'Malley? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. All right, sit up straight now. We're on standing orders again. Right. I will invite further discussion. Councillor Gary?
Just have a point of clarification, and that is, if we have a no surprises policy, how the heck were we surprised by the situation that triggered this motion?
Because it was covered by a confidentiality clause.
As most contracts of that level are. Further discussion? Okay. All right. In that case, I will put these. You happy for me to put them together? Yep. So all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? No. Carried. Thank you. Now I'll move from the chair, and thank you for all of your assistance in negotiating the shoals of standing orders in that regard. I'm going to move from the chair that the meeting move into confidential for the reasons outlined in the agenda pursuant to provisions of the Local Government Act, and that Mr Crombie, the chair of Dunedin City Holdings, be allowed to remain in the meeting after the public has been excluded to speak to item C2. Seconded, Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried.